Well, hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to OLC TV for some more Total War 3 Kingdoms, this time with something a little bit different, an animated essay if you will, discussing a defense of why Yuan Shu probably wasn't so stupid when he declared himself Emperor. So, here we have In Defense of Idiot Day, for those of you who have watched the 2010 Romance of the Three Kingdoms TV series with that infamous and brilliant scene with Cao Cao making a mockery of Yuan Shu's decision to declare himself Emperor, or why Yuan Shu had to declare himself Emperor for those of you who haven't seen the TV series. So we'll be discussing the precedent for declaring yourself Emperor, other candidates specifically during Yuan Shu's lifetime who had already tried and failed to become Emperor, his rivals with imperial ambition throughout the court and wider China, the Yuan name, its power base, and why that wasn't such a bad idea for someone of his lineage to declare himself Emperor, the political situation of the time, why it could have worked, and of course, what happened afterwards and why it failed. Okay, so on this map of China, I'm going to highlight the major Imperial Contenders who tried and failed through military force to declare themselves Emperor at one stage or another throughout Yuan Shu's lifetime. First amongst them we have in 172 CE a chap called Xu Cheng. Now Xu Cheng kicked off a rebellion down in Kuaiji in the southeast of China. Xu Cheng based his rebellion off this prophecy that Xu Cheng would herald the end of the Han Dynasty. Of course, unfortunately for him, he was not to be the Xu Cheng that heralded the end of the Han Dynasty. That was to be the capital of Wei, Xu Cheng, Xu City, which of course is the city that Cao Cao housed the emperor in after he gained control of him following the emperor's retreat from Chang'an to Luoyang in about 196 CE. He, of course, Xu Cheng was put down by Han forces. Amongst those forces, of course, the commander and famous general of the time, Sun Jian, who was just earning his stripes at that time. Next, we have Zhang Ju, who was backed up by a fellow countryman called Zhang Chun. They were backed by the Wuhuan tribes that rebelled in the area up in the northeast, and Gongsun Zan was tasked with putting them down. Gongsun Zan crushed their armies in battle and chased them, but of course overextended himself, as was his wont, and had to fall back after suffering massive casualties. The rebellion was eventually put down by Liu Yu, who became governor of the northeast. After him, in 188 CE, was a chap called the unnamed chap with the title of the Marquis of Perfet. Now, he was killed eventually, but this was started off with a court plot to place him on the throne. It failed, the people involved were killed. There are, however, rumours that Cao Cao was involved in this plot, though he was never caught or even really formally accused of being part of it. Then, the most famous of them all, in 189 CE, Liu Xian, who of course replaced his elder brother Liu Bian on the throne. Not through his own doing, of course. This was what Dong Zhuo did straight after taking control of the imperial capital. After that, we had a plot by the likes of Yuan Shao and Han Fu to place Liu Yu, who was an imperial relative, on the throne as a rival emperor. When Dong Zhuo had control of the emperor, the Eastern Coalition, at least a major factor of the Eastern Coalition, wished to place Liu Yu on the throne. Of course, Liu Yu refused, and Liu Yu was eventually killed by Gongsun Zan in infighting in the east. Following that, there was a chap backed by the likes of Tao Qian for a long time called Che Xuan. Of course, when Che Xuan actually declared himself emperor in 193 CE, that basically caused the ire of people he trusted as friends, including the likes of Tao Qian, and he was crushed completely. So, as you can see from that, even in Yuan Shu's lifetime, before he eventually declared himself emperor, there were a huge number of candidates who tried to place themselves on the throne or were political pawns being used by other people in power to be placed on the throne. Such was the corruption of the Han court at this time. Lots and lots of people with considerable power, of course, but not necessarily massive power, could be considered a rival threat to the empire. Now, the majority of these were either put down by unwillingness by the individual to participate, or by them simply being out of the way and easily cut off and destroyed. But there were a few others knocking around at this time who had at least rumours of imperial ambition, even if it was never proved that they wanted to become emperor themselves, including a number of imperial relatives. Of course, before we hit the imperial relatives, first and foremost is Zhang Jue. Now, he may not have wished to declare himself emperor per se, but he did wish to bring down the Han, and he was running a sort of theocratic, idealised version of society with the Yellow Turbans in the northeast, of which he would have been the leader. So even if he didn't declare himself emperor, he at least wanted to be in charge nonetheless. He, of course, leader of the Yellow Turbans, was put down pretty damn quickly. There's also Liu Chong, the Prince of Chen. Now, whether he wanted to declare himself emperor or not is uncertain, but he was reprimanded for making sacrifices to gods for desires above his station, basically for imperial desires. He was reprimanded for this, and his chancellor was executed, not his chancellor Lord Jun, its previous chancellor. And then after that, Liu Chong kept his head down. But the fact that Liu Chong was doing such a thing, was rumoured to be doing such a thing, just showed that the court probably didn't have so much control over some of its close relatives, including someone like Liu Chong, who was not very far from the capital city. Liu Biao, as well as Liu Yan, and now I know that's Liu Zheng's picture there, but we don't have one of Liu Yan, so Liu Yan is Liu Zheng's father. Both Liu Biao and Liu Yan used imperial regalia, signatures around their courts, their own personal court. And so this suggested rumours that they were sort of trespassing on imperial authority, or they were trying to usurp some of the authority for themselves. They were also, in their own way, especially Liu Yan, very far away from the capital, and could get away with a lot more autonomy than other people. So there were rumours that they were sort of playing for more imperial power over time. And then, of course, the big bad, Cao Cao himself. Now, I personally don't believe Cao Cao had imperial ambitions, but I do believe he foresaw that there was potential for the Han to fall and set everything up so that his family would prosper from this in the future. And certainly that's exactly what happened. Cao Cao pretty much forcing the emperor to abdicate and declaring himself emperor of Wei. So Cao Cao, I don't think personally ever saw himself as emperor, even though people did potentially suggest it to him over his lifetime. But being the strategic mind that he was, I'm pretty certain he looked at it and thought, this whole thing's going to fall apart. I've got to set myself up so my family can take over that. So to truly understand Yuan Shu's power and why he thought this could be used to elevate himself to emperor, we need to understand his sphere of influence, his heartland, and his direct control areas. First of all, we'll start with his heartland. So, Runan Commandery was the base of operations for the Yuan family. The Yuan family were an ancient noble family with incredible familial connections to other powerful noble families in the area as well as at court. They had incredible finances, and they had their own personal army. They could use Runan as a base of operations to raise troops, raise money, raise supplies, and attack. It was a very solid foundation for Yuan Shu based off. Unlike Yuan Shao, who was operating in an area where he didn't have familial ties, because of course, in the Yuan family, Yuan Shu was the head by this stage, whilst Yuan Shao, even though he was more charismatic and famous, was his brother, and that's partly the reason why they were fighting each other at the time. Now, directly before the coalition started, and in the immediate aftermath of the coalition, Yuan Shu had expanded his areas of direct control to Nanyang Commandery and Yangzhou Commandery, according to this map. Now, these areas were a lot more tenuous. Certainly Nanyang, he didn't really have the best grip on. He'd used it as a base of operations during the coalition, but he hadn't got the same ties to people like he did in Runan. Yangzhou, he had slightly better ties over time than he did in Nanyang, but again, these were areas where he could quite easily find food, find money, and find troops from. He was also, both by imperial decree and by his own posturing, nominally senior to the people in charge of Yingchuan and Chen, and this meant that they sort of offered him some level of allegiance. It's not a direct line of command, but it did place them within his sphere of influence. He had as well a sort of on-off friend and ally in Liu Biao, who didn't really get directly involved in fighting in the same way as other warlords and governments did at this time towards his south and west, making it relatively stable. And he had an area of expansion that he would push into in Liujiang. So let's have a look at things on a more strategic level. Now we know how Yuan Shu's power base worked. The Eastern Coalition formed to defeat Dongzhuo was made up of two major hegemony Rin, both headed by members of the Yuan family. One side, headed by Yuan Shu, with his area of influence and control, had the likes of Sun Jian as a general amongst them. Sun Jian, of course, was the most successful commander throughout the whole of the coalition against Dongzhuo. They had the highest quality troops, the best troops, huge amounts of funding, though of course they were headed by Yuan Shu, who probably wasn't the best strategic mind. Still, even after Sun Jian's death, they still had the likes of Sun Ce amongst them, who was a very great commander, Cheng Pu, Han Dang, Huang Gai. Okay, you could argue they weren't put to best use under Yuan Shu, but he still had them as a core fighting force. He had in the northeast an ally in Gongsun Zan. Now, Gongsun Zan, after a few years, had managed to kill his governor in Liu Yu and claim pretty much all of the northeast. Gongsun Du, of course, held Liao Shi, but he was more interested in conquering Korea. So Gongsun Zan, again, had a very, very strong cavalry mainly based force, but again they had a veterancy, they had battle readiness the other armies just didn't have. They were up against Yuan Shao, who had absorbed Han Fu, in doing so had absorbed generals like Zhang He, had absorbed generals like Qu Yi, and so he did have some talent in his forces, they had a level of veterancy, but they were not perhaps as well renowned or as experienced as Yuan Shu and Gongsun Zan's force. Yuan Shu also had an ally and personal friend in Tao Qian to his east, who could be relied on to harass the likes of Yuan Shao and his allies. Yuan Shao, of course, had an ally in Cao Cao. Now, Cao Cao was nominally inferior in this relationship, and was basically being backed and funded by Yuan Shao, sort of in the way that Julius Caesar was backed and funded by the likes of Crassus and Pompey in Triumvirate. Prior to the triumvirate of Rome, first triumvirate of Rome. But their relationship, they had been friends at university, they had known each other for very, very many years, and even though they would start to fall out over this period, they were in a situation where they could rely on each other to defend against attacks. The situation was like this. Cao Cao and Yuan Shu were fighting, Gongsun Zan and Yuan Shao were fighting, and Tao Qian, Cao Cao were fighting. And if you look at this, you're thinking, well, Cao Cao and Yuan Shao, doesn't matter how good they are, they're sort of surrounded. You've also got to throw in the fact that Zhang Yan was being funded and backed by the likes of Yuan Shu and Gongsun Zan to raid and attack Cao Cao and Yuan Shao as well. They've pretty much got them surrounded, and you'd think they'd eventually be worn down and destroyed. However, that was not to be the case. As we move to 197 CE, you can see how the area of influence had changed. Tao Qian has died, his territory has been taken over by Liu Bei, who has a tenuous connection to Yuan Shu, and they really personally didn't get on with each other very well. Liu Bei, of course, lost a huge amount of territory to Liu Bu. Liu Bu was someone who Yuan Shu tried very hard to work with, but neither of them really trusted each other. And, I mean, there are whole essays as to their relationship, it just didn't work. Gongsun Zan had been beaten one too many times and had locked himself up in his capital, and was basically just getting ready to die. Yuan Shao had him under siege and it was going to fall apart. Cao Cao had been at war with Yuan Shu and with Tao Qian and taken huge swathes of land. He had also taken command of an opportunity to take control of the emperor, giving him huge amounts of influence across China. At this stage, the situation had changed. No longer was it a two-way war, this was Cao Cao and Yuan Shao on the offensive. Yuan Shao had Gongsun Zan holed up in a corner. Cao Cao was launching wars all over the place, attacking the Black Mountain bandits, attacking Liu Bei, attacking Fu, allying with Liu Bei. You know, lots of stuff going on there, as well as more attacks against Yuan Shu. Now, Yuan Shu, as you can see, had gone from being either an equal or superior to this other hegemony to being inferior and on the verge of collapse. He needed to do something desperate to change the situation, and his move of desperation was to declare himself emperor. Now, why did he do this? You can see Sun Ce has appeared in the south. Sun Ce, of course, was a family friend, even though he had misused him, and he was taking a huge swathe of land in the south, which Yuan Shu would think would be nominally his to command. What he also was expecting to do was to create a rise out of his family connections in Runan to rebel against Cao Cao. Now, this was something that later on you'd see Yuan Shao use against Cao Cao during the Guandu campaign as well. This was something that was used by the Yuan family, even Yuan Tan, Yuan Shang, whatever. They tried to use it to gain some leverage over Cao Cao basically every time they tried it failed. However, what he also wanted was his former territory in Nanyang to rise up, but of course this was now under command of someone who swore allegiance to Liao, so again it didn't happen. He wanted Sun Ce to also come back and help with his forces in an attack, and he wanted to bring Liu Biao into an attack against Cao Cao. Why would they go against Cao Cao? Well, coalitions were formed against Dongzhuo. Cao Cao was no more using the emperor as a puppet than Dongzhuo had been previously, and Li Jue had been previously, and Guo Se had been previously, and all the others who had had control of the emperor at some stage. Precedent had been set. He also was expecting this marriage alliance with Lu Bu. Lu Bu, the great warrior, also then launches attack against Cao Cao. Gong Xinzan, hopefully at this stage, would be inspired to fight back rather than just hold himself up in his city. He could also potentially, and this is slightly off the wall, Yuan Shao didn't like the fact that Cao Cao had gone from being nominally inferior to nominally superior by having control of the emperor and having control of a huge swathe of land. If Yuan Shu was to declare himself emperor, then that would make Yuan Shao an imperial relative, a very, very senior imperial relative. So perhaps Yuan Shao would come on side too. Who knows? But I believe that was part of his thinking. So why might Yuan Shu's desperate gambit have worked? Well, first and foremost, there's precedent for people declaring themselves emperor. There are prophecies, there are people just with armies, there are imperial relatives being used as pawns by other members of the public with armies, and so you could argue that because he had the ability to take land, hold it with his army, and he had the wealth and support of regions to back him, that there was precedent for someone in his power base to declare themselves emperor. You of course need to look at Dongzhuo and the puppet emperor as well. The legitimate emperor was dead by the time Yuan Shu declared himself to be emperor, because Dongzhuo had poisoned him. The emperor sitting on the throne at the time was the rightful emperor's younger brother, and therefore didn't really hold the correct mandate to be emperor. He also had very close family ties to the Sun family. Now, from Yuan Shu's perspective, he would have expected Sun Ce and Wu Jing and the others from the Wu clan, who again were a very powerful clan along the Yangtze River, to have backed his bid to become emperor. Even though they did not, and we can look at this from a perspective in the future and say, haha, well, he made a mistake, these guys abandoned him. Actually, they didn't really abandon him, they just didn't really agree with him declaring himself emperor. They still supported his family after he died, looked after them, they intermarried between the families. So the Sun family and the Yuan family had very, very strong ties, and Yuan Shu must have expected Sun Ce and his forces and his influence with the other clans along the Yangtze to have fully backed his bid. He would also have been expecting neutral warlords to take his side in a coalition. Now, there were many ways he tried to go and persuade these neutral warlords, and we'll discuss a few of them a little bit later. But first and foremost, you need to remember that when Dongzhuo had taken control of the capital and taken control of the emperor, a coalition had almost immediately formed against him. Now, there were reasons why it happened so quickly, of course, because Dongzhuo did some horrific things in the court, and of course he he replaced the rightful emperor with another. But based off that precedent alone, he would have been expecting other members, especially his brother-in-law Yuan Shao, his half-brother Yuan Shao, to have gone against Cao Cao, because Cao Cao was effectively in a dongzhuo type position. And Cao Cao, when you look at the hierarchy of families in China at this time, the Yuan family were very much top of the pile. Cao Cao was high ranking, but he was not of the rank of even like the Xiaohou, who Cao Cao obviously had a close familial relationship with Xiahou Dun and Xiahou Yuan. They were a more senior family based on nobility. Like, okay, so Cao Cao's father had been an excellency, but they bought it, and their line came from being backed by Yuna. This did not place Cao Cao really on the nobility pile. So it gave Yuan Shu a level of legitimacy with other neutral warlords, the likes of Liu Biao, for example, Liu Chong, for example, to take his side against Cao Cao and say that Cao Cao was trying to power. And then there's also a level of Confucian conservatism. This is based around the idea that because of all the disasters that were happening at the time, the superstitious element of Confucianism would have suggested that basically the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. They had lost the support from heaven, so they were not worthy of loyalty. If you also roll this in with other superstitions at the time, and the prophecy of Xu Cheng becomes another one because Yuan Shu rolled that into his own idea. Yuan Shu was using superstition, he was using the ideas of Confucian loyalty, and he was using familial ties to essentially try and say, well, the Han Dynasty has fallen. They just don't yet. We have famine, we have natural disasters with floods and earthquakes, we have civil war, the emperor is not backed by heaven, let's make a new emperor, let's make a new dynasty, let's replace the red with the yellow, and let's go all in for Yuan Shu as Emperor of Zhong. Now, of course, this played into the hands of a lot of yellow turbans as well, because you've got to remember, even though Jiang Jue was long dead, there were still yellow turban rebellions kicking off all over the place, and Yuan Shu had very, very close ties to the yellow turban rebels who had risen in Hunan, which of course is his homeland, and they had fought for him against Cao Cao and others over this period of time. So he was also playing into this idea, which had led to many, many rebellions before anyways. He was sort of expecting a backing from the Taoists as well as the Confucians during this time. Of course, it didn't work. Unfortunately, after he declared himself emperor and sent out his letters and his reasoning, even though he was rumoured to have control of the imperial seal at this time, it unfortunately didn't work for him. The Sun family abandoned him, and if anything was a greater kick in the teeth, I do not know of it. As soon as Sun Ce had abandoned him, his cause was all but lost. He needed those experienced troops, even though they were few in number. He needed them because he needed their leadership. Up against a strategic genius in Cao Cao, who was collecting some really top-end commanders by this stage, Yuan Shu didn't stand a chance. Gongsun Zan, his greatest ally up in the northeast, had completely collapsed, and really there was no realistic way of counterattack against Yuan Shao. Yuan Shao, of course, didn't back him, because Yuan Shao was playing his own game, Yuan Shao always did. And so Yuan Shu was left more isolated than he had been at the beginning, was hunted down by Liu Bei, who had been a potential friend and ally, even if it didn't work out at one stage, and was killed eventually. Well, his armies were defeated, fled, his army starved. He launched an attack against the Prince of Chen, Liu Chong, and of course killed him. He killed off a few other people in trying to gain food and supplies for his army, but none of it. He gained too many enemies, found himself surrounded. His family fled to Sun Ce, where eventually one of his daughters became concubine to Sun Quan and had the opportunity to become Empress Wu, though rumour has it she turned it down. His son as well was another commander and general within Sun Ce and later Sun Quan forces. But he will always be remembered for being an idiot simply because he took an opportunity. He was placed into a position where he needed to make a desperate move to overturn his fortune. Completely failed. If you look at comparable situation, Cao Cao at Guandu, he had the opportunity to fall back, to surrender. He didn't. He took a desperate move, made a stand, even though his troops were beginning to starve, and won. Because of that, he controlled the north. Cao Cao again, at the Battle of White Wolf Mountain, took a risk. It paid off. Guan Yin against Ma Chao and Han Sui took a risk. It paid off. Gave him the northwest. And on the flip side, you look at the Battle of Red Cliff. He took a chance. It failed and prevented him from ever being able to fight China. So all of the generals at this time took risks. Yuan Shu was no different. The difference was between Yuan Shu and Cao Cao, or Liu Bei, or Sun Quan, and in these other great wars at the time, was that the dice simply didn't favour him. When he made a risky decision, it failed, he died. And unfortunately for him, history will remember him as an idiot, even though he probably was the other. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this. I understand this is a little bit longer than my usual historical videos. If you did enjoy this, please let me know below. It's a little bit different, a little bit of a move away from the regular battle tactics. So if you would like to see something like this, please let me know. If there's any feedback for this type of animated essay, please leave it below. Do you think they should be shorter? Do you think I should break them up into parts if they're longer like this one? Or would you like me to go into a little bit more detail in specific areas? Because I do keep them relatively general, just for time's sake, but I could quite easily do a series of shorter ones and go into more detail. Anyway, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for joining me. Bye-bye.